The collapse of Japanese naval aviation had begun months before this June morning, though few within the Imperial Navy's command structure recognized the pattern at the time. Following the catastrophic losses suffered at Midway in June 1942, then the prolonged attrition throughout the Solomon Islands campaign, and finally the devastating air battles over Rabaul, the Japanese Navy had hemorrhaged its most experienced pilots at a rate far exceeding any possibility of replacement. The problem was not simply that pilots were dying, but that the men dying were the veterans whose skills and experience could not be replicated through any training program, no matter how intensive or well-designed. Saburo Sakai, whose name ranked among Japan's leading surviving aces, had been forcibly withdrawn from combat operations after suffering serious wounds in August 1942. Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, known throughout the Japanese Naval Air Service as the Devil of Rabaul for his extraordinary combat prowess, had been killed in October 1943 while travelling as a passenger in a transport aircraft. His talents wasted in a non-combat loss that exemplified the inefficiencies plaguing Japanese operations. The men who had executed the meticulously planned attack on Pearl Harbor, the veterans who had refined carrier operations through years of training and combat experience, were mostly dead by mid-1944. The institutional knowledge they represented had been irretrievably lost. Among the aviators preparing for launch operations that morning sat Ensign Takeo Yamamoto, 19 years old, with exactly 82 hours of total flight time recorded in his logbook. His personal diary, recovered after the war from family members and subsequently made available to historians, provides one of the few detailed accounts of the psychological state confronting Japanese pilots as they faced the reality of American technological superiority. 3 days before the battle, Yamamoto had written with remarkable clarity about the disconnect between official propaganda and observable reality. His superiors constantly emphasized that fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantage, but Yamamoto had studied reconnaissance photographs of American aircraft and struggled to reconcile doctrine with evidence. The American planes were demonstrably bigger, newer, and vastly more numerous than anything Japan fielded. His diary posed a question that military leadership refused to answer. How does fighting spirit overcome radar systems that can see in darkness and track targets beyond visual range? The intelligence gathering that should have warned Japanese commanders of their deteriorating position had been systematically dismissed or reinterpreted to fit existing strategic assumptions. In April 1944, Japanese reconnaissance flights over American anchorages in the Marshall Islands had photographed new carrier types that should have fundamentally altered Japanese strategic calculations. The Essex-class carriers, with full load displacements of 27,100 tons, each carried between 90 and 100 aircraft. Japanese intelligence had counted 15 of these vessels already operational in the Pacific Theater, with photographic evidence suggesting more appeared monthly. The implications of this construction rate alone should have been sufficient to force a strategic reassessment, but Japanese naval leadership continued operating under assumptions formed during their period of dominance in 1941 and early 1942. Lieutenant Masahiko Okumiya, serving as air operations officer aboard the carrier Hio, had studied these reconnaissance photographs with growing concern that his superiors did not share. In his post-war interrogations with American naval intelligence officers, Okumiya revealed the limitations of Japanese understanding at the time. They knew Americans possessed more carriers, but this superficial numerical awareness masked a deeper misunderstanding of what those numbers represented. Each American carrier possessed repair facilities and maintenance capabilities that Japanese carriers could not match. An Essex-class carrier could repair aircraft damage that would result in Japanese crews pushing the damaged plane overboard as unsalvageable. A single American carrier possessed more organic maintenance and repair capability than the entire Japanese carrier fleet combined. Commander Minoru Genda, whose tactical genius had shaped the Pearl Harbor attack and who now served on Admiral Toyoda's staff, had been reading captured American pilot interrogation reports with escalating alarm that his recommendations could not overcome institutional resistance to unpleasant realities. According to these captured documents, American pilots received 350 hours of primary flight training, followed by 200 hours of advanced training, followed by an additional 100 hours of training with their operational squadrons before being considered combat-ready. If these numbers were accurate, and Gender had no reason to doubt their veracity, then every American pilot arriving at a carrier possessed approximately 5 times the flight training of current Japanese aircrew. Gender had written in a staff memorandum that went ignored that Japan was sending children to fight professionals, and that no amount of fighting spirit could overcome such a fundamental disparity in preparation. The morning of June 19, 1944, arrived with clear skies and excellent visibility, perfect flying weather that would offer no concealment for either fleet and would allow both sides to operate at maximum efficiency. At 4:30 in the morning, Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commanding the Japanese mobile fleet from his flagship, the new carrier Taiho, ordered search planes launched to locate the American task force. 30 minutes later, at 5 o'clock, Warrant Officer Sakai Manda, piloting a reconnaissance bomber on an extended search pattern, transmitted the first confirmed sighting of American carriers. Task Force 58, under the command of Admiral Mark Mitcher, comprised 15 carriers, 7 battleships, 21 cruisers, and 69 destroyers, representing a concentration of naval power unprecedented in the Pacific War. At 7:30 in the morning, Admiral Ozawa ordered the launch of his first strike wave, consisting of 69 aircraft. As these planes formed up into their assigned formations and set course for the American fleet, radar operators aboard the American battleship USS Alabama were already tracking them from a distance of 150 miles. The Japanese pilots were flying toward an enemy who had been watching their approach for nearly an hour, who had complete information about their numbers, altitude, and heading, who could coordinate defensive responses with a precision impossible for forces relying on visual detection alone. Admiral Mitcher's response to these radar contacts was immediate and unambiguous: launch all available fighters. The F-6F Hellcat had been specifically designed by Grumman engineers to defeat the Zero in air combat. Every aspect of the Hellcat's design reflected lessons learned from 2 years of Pacific combat. Its Pratt & Whitney engine generated 2,000 horsepower compared to the Zero's 1,130 horsepower. This power advantage translated into superior speed and climb rate that allowed Hellcat pilots to dictate the terms of engagement. The Hellcat carried protective armor plating behind the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb significant battle damage, features the Zero entirely lacked in its pursuit of maximum maneuverability. The Hellcat's 650 caliber machine guns could destroy a Zero with just a few hits, while Zero pilots needed sustained fire to bring down the more heavily constructed American aircraft. Lieutenant Alex Vrasiu, flying from USS Lexington, would achieve 6 confirmed victories in this single engagement, and his post-battle debriefing provided insight into just how completely outmatched the Japanese aircraft were. The Japanese formations flew predictably, maintaining tight formations that made them excellent targets for diving attacks. When American fighters dove on them from higher altitudes, Japanese pilots attempted to turn into the attack, but at the high speeds involved their control surfaces locked up, making them unable to maneuver effectively. American pilots maintained their speed and altitude advantages, using tactics that played to the Hellcat's strengths while avoiding the turning dogfights where Zeros retained some advantage. The result was systematic destruction. The first Japanese strike wave lost 41 aircraft out of 69 launched. American losses amounted to 1 Hellcat shot down. At 8:30 in the morning, Admiral Ozawa launched his second strike wave, consisting of 128 aircraft. This represented the largest single coordinated carrier strike of the entire war, a massive commitment of air power that should have overwhelmed any defense. But the American Combat Air Patrol had been stacked in multiple layers ranging from 17,000 to 24,000 feet altitude, with fighter director officers using radar data to coordinate the movements of hundreds of aircraft simultaneously. This level of coordination was impossible for Japanese forces to achieve or counter. The American fighter direction system allowed controllers to vector groups of Hellcats precisely onto incoming Japanese formations, ensuring that defending fighters always enjoyed altitude and positional advantages. Yeoman Second Class. Ito Takeshi, serving as a radio operator aboard a dive bomber in the second strike wave, survived the mission and later described what the Japanese aviators experienced. The sky transformed into what he characterized as a shooting gallery, with American fighters appearing from every direction, always possessing altitude advantage, always able to dive through Japanese formations with impunity. American pilots flew through the Japanese formations like sharks moving through schools of fish, he recorded, picking targets at will and destroying them systematically. By noon, the second strike wave had lost 97 of its 128 aircraft. American losses amounted to 4 Hellcats. The third Japanese strike wave of 48 aircraft launched at 10 o'clock in the morning. Their leader, Lieutenant Commander Takeo Miyano, had been promoted to command just days earlier, elevated to replace more experienced officers who had been killed in previous engagements. His final radio transmission, intercepted and recorded by American communications intelligence, conveyed the hopelessness of the Japanese tactical situation in stark simplicity. Enemy fighters everywhere, we cannot reach the target. Most of this wave was destroyed before achieving any attacks on American ships. The anti-aircraft defenses that awaited any Japanese aircraft that managed to penetrate the fighter screen represented another technological advantage Japanese forces had never encountered. American ships were equipped with proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, representing a revolutionary advancement in defensive capability. These shells incorporated miniature radar sets that caused them to detonate automatically when passing near an aircraft, creating lethal fragmentation clouds that did not require direct hits. Seaman First Class Yoshio Nakamura, one of the few Japanese aircrew to survive attacks on American ships, described shells exploding from impossible distances, filling the sky with shrapnel clouds through which no aircraft could safely fly. The fourth strike wave of 82 aircraft launched at 11 o'clock in the morning, but by this point coordination of Japanese operations had completely collapsed. 49 aircraft, low on fuel and unable to locate the American task force, diverted to Guam to refuel. They flew directly into 27 waiting Hellcats that had been positioned over the airfield. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell, who would emerge from the war as the Navy's leading ace, described destroying Japanese aircraft as they attempted to land as target practice rather than combat. The Japanese pilots were completely helpless, focused on landing operations and unable to defend themselves. Throughout these sustained attacks, American carriers maintained continuous flight operations for over 12 hours without significant interruption. Deck crews could rearm and refuel a fighter aircraft in approximately 15 minutes, allowing rapid turnaround of defending fighters. Japanese carriers required nearly an hour to perform the same operations, a difference in efficiency that multiplied American defensive capabilities. This disparity in operational tempo meant that American carriers could maintain larger numbers of aircraft in the air for longer periods, while Japanese carriers struggled to generate successive strike waves. As the afternoon progressed, catastrophe struck the Japanese carrier force itself. At 12:20, the American submarine USS Albacore, positioned along the projected Japanese course, fired 6 torpedoes at the carrier Taiho. Warrant Officer Sakio Komatsu, who had just taken off from Taiho's flight deck, spotted the torpedo wakes approaching the carrier. In an act of supreme self-sacrifice, Komatsu deliberately crashed his aircraft into one of the torpedoes, destroying it at the cost of his own life. His heroism saved Taiho from one torpedo, but the 6th torpedo struck home, rupturing aviation fuel tanks and causing gasoline vapors to spread throughout the vessel. Poor damage control procedures, reflecting inadequate training of repair parties, allowed these volatile vapors to accumulate in enclosed spaces. At 2:32 in the afternoon, Taiho exploded catastrophically and sank, taking approximately 1,650 men with her, including Admiral Ozawa's staff. At 2:20 in the afternoon, the carrier Shokaku, veteran of numerous engagements dating back to Pearl Harbor, took 3 torpedo hits from the American submarine USS Kavala. Without experienced damage control teams, fires spread unchecked through the vessel. At 3:01, Shokaku exploded and sank. Another veteran carrier lost not to air attack but to submarine warfare that Japanese anti-submarine forces proved incapable of countering effectively. As evening approached, Admiral Ozawa faced losses of staggering magnitude. Of 430 aircraft launched in strike operations, only 130 remained operational. Japanese naval aviation had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force in a single day of combat. The American response demonstrated both their material superiority and their confidence in that superiority. On June 20th, Admiral Mitchell launched a late-afternoon strike of 216 aircraft at extreme range, stretching fuel reserves to their limits to attack the retreating Japanese fleet. This strike succeeded in sinking the carrier Hiyo and damaging several other vessels. When these American aircraft returned in darkness, facing the dangerous prospect of night carrier landings with minimal fuel reserves, Admiral Mitchell made a decision that exemplified the fundamental difference between the two navies. He ordered all ships in Task Force 58 to illuminate, turning on every available light to guide pilots home. This decision risked exposing the task force to submarine attack, but Mitchell prioritized saving his aircrew over maintaining operational security. 100 aircraft were lost in landing accidents or fuel exhaustion, but only 76 aircrew died as destroyer rescue operations saved most downed pilots. The American Navy could replace lost aircraft quickly, but considered trained pilots irreplaceable. The statistical accounting of the Battle of the Philippine Sea told a story of complete annihilation of Japanese naval aviation. Japanese losses totaled 3 carriers sunk, approximately 600 aircraft destroyed, including land-based planes from Guam and other island bases, and nearly 3,000 personnel killed. American losses amounted to 130 aircraft destroyed and 76 aircrew killed. These numbers represented not merely a tactical defeat, but the effective elimination of Japanese carrier aviation as a strategic factor in the Pacific War. Post-war technical analysis revealed the full extent of American technological advantages. The proximity fuse increased the kill probability of anti-aircraft fire by approximately 700% compared to conventional time-fused or contact-fused shells. The F-6F Hellcat would finish the war with an overall kill ratio of 19-1 against Japanese aircraft. American radar could track targets at 150 miles compared to Japanese radar barely functional at 50 miles. The disparity in industrial production made any Japanese recovery impossible. In 1944, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft, while Japanese industry managed 28,000. American factories operated on continuous shifts, while Japanese production operated sporadically due to raw material shortages and increasing bomber attacks on the home islands. The pilot training disparity proved even more insurmountable than equipment differences. American aviators received approximately 600 hours of training before assignment to operational squadrons, while Japanese pilots averaged under 100 hours. This difference meant American pilots arrived at their carriers with fundamental flying skills so ingrained that they could focus entirely on tactical considerations, while Japanese pilots remained preoccupied with basic aircraft handling. American carriers used steam catapults for aircraft launching, allowing operations in calm conditions, while Japanese carriers relied on natural wind over the deck, limiting operational flexibility. American ships featured air conditioning systems that kept electronic equipment functioning reliably in tropical conditions, and even amenities like ice cream machines for crew morale. Japanese crews subsisted on rice rations and operated equipment that frequently malfunctioned in the heat and humidity. The radar technology gap proved impossible for Japanese forces to overcome through any tactical means. Every American ship possessed radar systems that provided comprehensive situational awareness day and night in any weather conditions. Japanese commanders operated essentially blind beyond visual range, forced to rely on scouting aircraft that could be shot down or evaded. This disparity meant that American forces could always choose the time and manner of engagement, while Japanese forces reacted to situations they could not fully perceive. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal noted in his assessment of the battle that every American worker shared in this victory. The factories of Detroit and Pittsburgh had won this battle alongside the pilots in their cockpits. General Curtis LeMay, commanding the strategic bombing campaign against Japan, acknowledged that the Navy's victory at the Philippine Sea gave his forces the Mariana Islands as bases for B-29 superfortress operations. Without eliminating Japanese naval aviation as a threat, American forces could not have taken and held these crucial bases from which the strategic bombing campaign would eventually force Japanese surrender. Production statistics demonstrated the hopelessness of Japan's strategic position. While Japanese shipyards struggled to repair damaged carriers, American shipyards completed an average of 7 new carriers monthly. Lieutenant Kaneo Oshimoto, assigned to a naval air training command in Japan, described the impossible situation confronting Japanese training programs. They were attempting to train pilots in 6 weeks instead of the pre-war standard of 2 years. Sending these minimally trained aviators against Hellcats flown by veteran pilots was not combat, it was murder, he later testified. President Franklin Roosevelt emphasized in public statements how American ingenuity, industrial capacity, and courage united were invincible. Every rivet in every aircraft, every part manufactured in every factory, contributed directly to victory. Admiral Chester Nimitz analyzed that while the Japanese fleet remained afloat after the Philippine Sea, it had been rendered strategically impotent. American forces could now choose when and where to strike without facing meaningful naval opposition. Lieutenant Commander Takashi Hirose summarized the Japanese perspective with brutal honesty in his post-war writings. Courage without capability is worthless. Spirit without material support is suicide, and the Americans possessed both courage and overwhelming material superiority. In modern industrial warfare, courage alone proved insufficient. By sunset on June 20, 1944, Japanese carrier aviation had ceased to exist as an effective fighting force. The carefully trained air groups had been annihilated in history's most one-sided carrier battle. Admiral Ozawa's final operational report read like an epitaph for Japanese naval aviation. The mobile fleet had been rendered impotent, he reported. They possessed carriers without aircraft, aircraft without qualified pilots, pilots without adequate training, and most critically, their material inferiority had been demonstrated as absolute. The age of Japanese carrier warfare had ended in the Philippine Sea. Commander David McCampbell reflected in his combat reports that after the Philippine Sea engagement, American carrier forces never again faced serious aerial opposition from Japanese naval aviation. The real victory was not simply destroying aircraft in combat, but destroying Japan's ability to train replacement pilots at any meaningful scale. The experienced instructors had been fed into combat operations where they were killed, leaving no one capable of training new aviators to adequate standards. Every subsequent engagement saw Japanese pilot quality decline further as minimally trained replacements faced veteran American pilots flying superior aircraft. By the war's end, the production statistics told the full story of industrial warfare. America produced 141 aircraft carriers of all types during the war. Japan completed 7. American factories built 324,000 aircraft. Japan managed 76,000. The disparity in every category of military production proved insurmountable for Japanese forces, regardless of tactical skill or fighting spirit. Captain Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the air attack on Pearl Harbor and survived the war to write extensively about Japanese naval operations, composed perhaps the most penetrating analysis of what the Battle of the Philippine Sea represented. The Japanese Navy had attacked Pearl Harbor with approximately 350 aircraft, considering themselves invincible masters of carrier warfare. At the Philippine Sea, Americans lost more aircraft in 2 days than Japan had possessed at Pearl Harbor, yet American operations continued without pause. Japan had awakened an industrial machine that produced military victories with the same efficiency that American factories produced automobiles. The entire war represented a fundamental mismatch between traditional military thinking and industrial age warfare. The Battle of the Philippine Sea demonstrated conclusively that industrial capacity could defeat traditional military prowess when the disparity reached sufficient magnitude. The Japanese pilots who flew into combat on June 19, 1944, were no less brave than the Pearl Harbor veterans who had dominated the Pacific in 1941 and early 1942. But courage meant nothing against radar-guided defenses, against Hellcats flown by superbly trained pilots, against proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells, against an enemy who could absorb losses and replace them immediately, while Japanese losses proved irreplaceable. Lieutenant Commander Irikin's final diary entry, recovered after the Shokaku sank, captured the fundamental truth that Japanese military leadership had refused to acknowledge. They had been defeated by American factories, he wrote. Every destroyed aircraft was replaced by 2 better ones. Every killed pilot was replaced by 3 with superior training. Japan had fought American industry and lost decisively. The Americans had transformed warfare into mass production, operating on industrial principles, while Japan remained locked in an artisanal mindset appropriate for an earlier age. The assembly line had defeated the craftsman, and no amount of skill or dedication could overcome that fundamental disparity. The sun had set on Japanese naval aviation in the Philippine Sea, never to rise again. The hundreds of Hellcats that destroyed nearly 400 Japanese aircraft had accomplished more than winning a tactical engagement. They had demonstrated that industrial democracy could produce military victory with the same certainty that assembly lines produced consumer goods. The so-called turkey shoot represented not an aberration, but the inevitable outcome when industrial capacity confronted traditional military forces. The age of industrial warfare had fully arrived in the Pacific, and Japan had no answer to its relentless logic. The battle had ended, but its implications would shape the remainder of the war and the peace that followed.